Hi everyone and welcome back, and let's finish our auth service which we started in our previous video. This video is part of UberEats clone playlist series. Okay, so what we were doing, we actually baselined our application. We have a Docker container running. Now there is a choice I'm giving you that sometimes what happens is we should be able to run the Node.js without container also, because I can run it's easier for me to debug and restart the application quickly without even Docker. So sometimes people, what they do is they keep this Postgres running in the Docker itself, but I can remove it. That is just for my development purpose. I can remove this Node.js from here, and what I will do is I will just do Docker compose up. What it will give me, it will spin up the container. Docker compose up. I need to go into packages and then auth service. Okay, so it will just keep the Postgres container up and running. We can see here auth service node, we don't need it. Here we can just check the log. Currently it's running, but you can kill it. That's on you. I just want to kill it for now. Just like remove, it will remove this container, and we have only Postgres. Okay, so now as we have only Postgres container up and running, what we can do is we need to change our database URL, because now our host is going to talk to the container, right? So we will just change it to the local host, and now the port will also change, because on the host we have to access 5434, not 5432. Okay, this is in the .env. Now we need to write our code how we can start our Node.js server. So we can just do is npm run start, I guess. Sorry, I'm going to auth service whenever I switch to a new terminal. So it's doing the same. What is happening here is it is running the migration. So where it is looking for the migration, it is looking for the migrations inside the orm config.ts, right? So this is our orm config.ts. Here it is checking for the database URL. It is running the migration, so we are good. Okay, I mean that is a code error, because we don't have a core module. We'll just remove it, and our application will start working as it is. So these are the migrations, and then npm run start, Nest start, and our application is running. Now we are able to just run the Postgres as a container. Node.js we can do here. We can do a lot of things, like you can create a debug port and npm run dev, npm run watch, all those commands. Here what we are doing is npm run start, but you can also start the nestjs server in the debug mode using --debug. Okay, start dev will keep watching. Like say if I do npm run start dev, so it will also keep checking for the file changes happening in your code base. Whenever you change anything, it will restart, right? That's good for our development purpose. Now let's come here and start writing our code. First of all, we are going to write our database module, and then we will add some migrations and all sort of things we are going to do. Okay, so for the database module, we are inside database. We create a database service. We'll create a db.module.ts. First, let's create a config, because config is the module which will populate the config in the whole application. So here we will create a config service.ts, config module.ts, and some interface. Config.default variables, config.interface.ts. Okay, so this is the whole application interface, right? So what we are going to define is, in the config default, there's a config default. Inside this we are going to define all the default values of our environment variables if you are not able to find them anywhere. default config. We will define the type for this, like let's say the config data. This type we are going to define inside interface, export interface config data, and here we are going to define all our types. Okay, I'm going to put env, which is going to be of type string in my environment. I mean, there are many ways to have these config service. You can just use the config service provided by nestjs config, and it will put all the things from your .env to process.env, because that is the thing we want, and the db, because we are just using only these three configuration. Config database, this is another type. I'm creating config database, so here we'll create export interface config data, so database config. And what we are going to have inside database config is just a URL, config database, and just a URL, because everything we are going to put inside the URL. Okay, config database, here we have one value. You can put a number of things. Let's say in your application you also have a Swagger, you have some external APIs. So here I will just say config Swagger. I will create a type, and inside config Swagger I am putting two variables, export interface, and here I have a username. I mean, you wanted to protect your Swagger interface, Swagger documents. This is a config Swagger, and log levels and all these things also you can add, which is of type string. Okay, this is my config data, and this is of type config data. And now we are going to define the default values. So env, the default value is production, if you are not specifying anything. Database, in the db we have defined, I think, two values. Identifier expected. This config data we have to import. This is of type config data, and config data we already defined, add import. And the db is, we have one variable here, url. So it's, we are going to get this from process.env database url. This is the default value. And why it is complaining, you know, there are a couple of more values we need to declare. The url, and then there is a, I think, Swagger. Here there are two properties, username, password, and I mean those are the only required things we have. There is, I think, log level also there. Default config, there is a port which is of type number. So this is also we can get from env, or the default if you want to set 3001. Was it inside config was of type number or string? Let's see. Port was of type number, so here we need to parse it. Process.env.port will be a string. So what we will do is, even if this is undefined, we will have the numeric value, and then just part your class name. This is my config service, and then what this config service will do is, this config service you will inject at a lot of different places to feed the config data here and there. Here we have a constructor. Here you can inject the default config, and this is my private config value. I'm going to write a class that will give us the config data. So it has a constructor and this config data. Config data. Okay, what this constructor will do is, this will initialize our config with the default data. This data is of type config data, is initialized with default config. We are good, and this dot config equal to data. So this is how we initialized our config with the default values. Now what we can do is we can populate the different values from process.env. So load from is a kind of function we are going to write, and what this function will do is it will populate the config from this dot parts config from env, and here you will pass the env which is of type node.js dot let's fix this. This should be node.js dot process env. This is actually a type. Env, something like this. Env also has a type, and what this is going to give us, this is going to give us the config data. This is my own service. I mean, I could have used Nest JS config for that, but this service is also doing the same thing. Here this dot config, I will populate the config from here, which we are already doing. So this function should return a config data. This dot config equal to this dot parse config from env. So here, okay, I'm calling this function, sorry for that, process.env, and this function we need to write. This is the function which will return us whatever we need, and this is the private function to make it little secure, because only this can be called internally from this class. And here what it is going to return, it's all the different things what we need, process.env, and we need to pass the environment also, and this will just return the config data. I will explain what it is going to do, right? So what it should return, because here we are saying is this dot config is of type config data, it should return it. So what all things we need? Env. So env you can get from env dot node env. If you don't get it, then you can access it from the default config dot, there is also we have env. Similarly, provide all the other things. Port, either you already have defined inside the env, so we use parse int, so you will get from the env which is process.env, env.port, which you will get from here, and db. So you can write a separate function for it. Let's say I will deal with that separately, and then we have what, Swagger. You can define a separate function for it also. So let's say we can write another function is this dot. Okay, so we are going to just write the function this dot parse swagger config, and here this dot parse db config, and pass the env. So we'll just pass our default env and the config. These are the two arguments. If you have anything from the env, otherwise just pass the default config also inside this default config dot db. Here also you can pass default config dot swagger, and we define these methods. What else is missing? Swagger, env port, log level is missing. So log level we can define. This we can get from env dot log level. It should be in uppercase. Okay, parse dbconfig. Here define these methods: private parse dbconfig, and there is another method is private parse swagger config. What these methods should return? That's the same thing. Parse dbconfig will return the database configurations from this. Parse dbconfig should return this. We are passing two arguments here: env, which is node.js dot process env. That is the first argument, and second argument is a default config. Default config is of type. You can also set read only, because we are not going to modify it. Read only config data. So default config dot URL. Okay, this default config should be of type, because we have defined a type here is config database, not config data, config database. You import the config database also, that is a interface. Okay, so we are done with this. Similarly, I can just copy this, it should be quicker. So here it is a parse swagger config, and here is username, and the interface here will be config interface config swagger. We are passing from here, you see, default config dot swagger, so the type will be config swagger, and default config dot username, env dot, here we can just check what will be this env value, swagger dot username. With this value, I will populate the value inside a process.env, and this is a password. Swagger username, so it will be a password, and instead of this, it will be a password. Config swagger we need to import. That's it. So it's like a config service, and then finally we also need to write a function, this dot get static function. I mean just a getter method, public get, and this is going to return us the read only config data. Config data, and what it will do is it's going to return this dot config. So what you need to do, call this function get function on the instance of this config service, and you need to call the get function to get the config object. Then you can do dot database dot swagger dot log level. This is a simple config service we have written. Okay, if you're not passing the value, then it will use the default config. From the default config, it will load the values from this. Okay, so what we need to do is, this is a config service ready. We can just write a config module. That is simple. Now what the config module will do, config module will here we are going to write a factory. So this is how you write a module. This is our module. Okay, inside module what we are doing is, are we importing anything? Imports empty, we are not having any dependency. Controllers, what happened with that? Why it's not auto importing things? Import module from Nest JS common. Controllers empty. Providers we may have the services defined, and then the exports we can define that. Okay, so this is our simple module, and we will define the class for it. I mean, in the Nest JS, either you write a controller, service, or a module, you have to have a class with these annotations: annotation module, annotation controller, annotation injectable. We have a config export class config module. Okay, Now the important part here is we are going to create a factory. So const config factory. What this factory will do, this factory will provide a class. So because this is a service, right, there are 3 different or 5 different ways to declare a service inside a module. Either we just provide a put a providers, and inside providers just put the name, right? Here we are doing a provide, and what we are providing config service, which is we have created, and this is going to call use factory. Const config equal to new config service. This is how we can get the instance of that service, and then config dot load from env, this we are going to call, and what it is going to return is config. Now why I did that, you might be wondering what is the use of this. Here I will put that in the providers, and I will put that in the exports. What we're doing here is we got the instance of it, and then we are calling load from env. What this load from env is doing, it explicitly putting things from the process.env to this config object. Otherwise, I mean, we can just use this service without using factory also inside the providers. Let's say I'm not doing this, and I just put a config service. What will happen is, yes, it is still providing the config service instance, but we are not calling anything, right? That instance doesn't have any value, any configuration, only the default configuration from the constructor. But otherwise what you need to do is you need to first call this method after getting the instance and then use this config. That's why it's better if we call this method by ourselves and just return the config to the end customer who is going to use this config module. That's why what we are doing is we created a config factory, we are providing the config service, and that config service is returning this. So we call this method will put things inside a config, and we are returning from this. So this is our config service. You will understand it how we are using it inside a database module. Okay, you might be thinking, am I doing a lot of things here? I mean, am I over engineering this thing? So if you don't want to use this, there are other better options. I'm not saying there are better options, but like Nest JS config, what you can do is you just create a config module, just a simple plain config module, and then what you simply do is just create a env and just do it config module dot for root. What it will do is you will have a .env file, in that you will have all these configuration, username, password and all. It will put them in the process.env directly, and then wherever you want to use these values, you will do is process.env database host, database port, database URL, because we are just using inbuilt provided config module, or in this particular case we wrote our own config module. But that's on you. You can just write config module.for root, or there are other variants of it. You can just explicitly pass the env file name also based on maybe the environment or something like that. Config module.for root. Here then this is how you will access the values from process.env. Okay. So there are different variants of using this. You can also pass a file name, and from the file name it will load the configuration. In our case, we are doing kind of a similar thing, reading it from the process.env and providing that through the some class instance. Okay, now database. So inside database we are going to have database service, database module, and DB interface. For database also, I'm going to do a little bit over engineering. Otherwise what you can do is simply typeorm. I'm going to write a database module which you can use everywhere. This is how you can do it. You can write a data source from typeorm and just write this database providers, and then use it like this, database providers, and this is becomes your total database module. You can use it anywhere you want, right? Here you write the entities, and then this is how you will create your different providers. Photo repositories, use repository, and you will get the data source from typeorm, get repositories. I mean, there are many ways of doing it. What I will do is, there is a warning. Yes, I mean, that's true. Either you write your own database module, which I'm going to do. Otherwise, what you can do is you can just use this database provider and start using this. Okay. We will talk about all these parameters you are passing here. I'm going to use just a URL which contains the host name, port, everything, and you will pass the entities, synchronize, true, false, all sort of configurations. So let's talk about database interface. Okay, so here in the database module, what all the things you need? You need to pass type, host, port, username, and all these things. That means a connection URL. We have only single property, that is URL. And then you need to pass the directory of all the entities. This is how the typeorm module will be initialized. Entities directory, where you are defining user.entities.ts, profile.entities.ts, whatever the .ts, right? These are three main arguments. This is the connection URL, entities, and the synchronized flag, which can be true and false. So let's define our interface. In the database interface, I'm just going to import things from the typeorm. And here export interface dbconfig. Inside dbconfig, I'm going to have entities. With entities, I need to feed to the typeorm. So here I'm going to use connection options coming from typeorm, and these are entities. What happened with this? Connection options does exist. Okay, it's fine. That was just a warning. This entities we need to pass from wherever we are initializing the typeorm module. So let's write our database module, and this is going to be interesting, right? So here, this is our database module. Export class DB module. Inside this, we are going to do a lot of things. Before that, this is the Nest JS module, right? So we will import the Nest JS module. Inside this, what we are going to define all our classes, because this is going to be a dynamic module. This because we will be injecting the config module to provide us the connection URLs and all sort of things we are going to do inside this particular module. So first of all, what we are going to do is, maybe this is little advanced stuff, but you might have seen this kind of a thing in the nestjs, how to write the dynamic module in the nestjs. Here I'm going to override this for root method. This for root method will take dbconfig as an input. Can be a simple dbconfig. Okay, and here what this module is going to return, this module is going to return the class. This is db module, and what all we are going to import here, imports. So inside imports, we are going to use typeorm module. Typeorm module. Why it's not coming up? Typeorm module, and we are going to call that. Let's import it. Oh, it's undefined. That's strange. So we can first define this. Import typeorm module from nestjs typeorm. And I'm going to import typeorm module. Now it got it. So there are different methods provided by this module. For root async. So I'm going to call for root async, and this will take an object as an input because this is a dynamic module. So here we are going to import whatever is needed. Imports because this module is dependent on other modules. So because we have a config module somewhere defined, and let's say config module only for now. So here we are going to use factory. Here I'm going to pass config service. Initially it looks like, okay, what complex thing I'm writing, but this is how you write this is how you write a dynamic module. Return, and here I'm going to do is db module. I'm going to write a one method inside this class is get connection options, private static, this method we are going to call from here db module dot get connection options, and inside this method I'm going to pass the config service instance of config service. And after this, what all we are going to inject is the config service inside this. So it's like a dynamic module I have created, and inside that I am using this config module, and config service I'm injecting inside this because I'm importing config module, so I can access the config service inside this module. So get connection option, here inside a connection option I'm passing config service, config service. Okay, and what this particular method should return typeorm connection options, typeorm module options, because here we are initializing the typeorm module. Let me just bring it down so you can get the full view. And here inside this method is important. Here we are going to get the data from the config, const db data equal to config dot get is a method there, and from that I can access db that has everything. If I don't get this data, that means you didn't provide the connection option. If you didn't pass the db data, that means you can just throw error. We will define the custom errors for it. Otherwise we'll just create a connection option, connection options equal to, now we can write this module class for all different kind of database. Okay, so here we are going to call it this dot get connection options Postgres, let's say, because Postgres is the database we are using db data, and we can define this method private static get connection options Postgres. Otherwise what you can do is you can also pass the dialect or database type. Based on that you can write a custom method. So the get connection option of MongoDB, MySQL, Postgres, and what we are going to return from this is the configuration values. Okay, what it should return is, here we are passing db data of type config db data, config database, right? This is URL we have. So what we are going to type return from this is type is Postgres. We need to pass this to the typeorm. URL is db data dot URL. Keep connection alive, all these options are also there, I guess. Keep connection alive true. It should return typeorm module options. We'll keep connection alive, and here SSL, because when we use it on the production environment SSL is required, right? Otherwise, so if let's say particular condition is process.env, if our environment is local or test, we don't need we will just return reject unauthorized false. Otherwise we need SSL true. This is really critical because sometimes your locally Postgres is working fine, but on production it is not working because that has SSL enabled, and you need to pass SSL true. Okay, so what we are doing is SSL if this environment is not local and not test, unauthorized false, otherwise SSL false. Or there may be a condition where your production database has SSL enabled. Okay, so now we are returning this, and then from here we can return the whole thing. We got the connection options from here. Connection options. What else we are adding? Entities, which we were passing here inside a config. Okay, get connection options. Okay, here we need to pass this db config also, so we can pass all the entity classes. It will take 2 arguments. So db config, and it will be db config dot all the entities, all the TypeScript classes. Synchronization, why it's not enabled with the TypeScript? Typeorm module options. You can see these all things you need to add inside this typeorm module options. I'm just looking at the TypeScript definitions. What all things you can return from this? So synchronize and logging. Synchronization means we will talk about this parameter. It will always synchronize your entities with the database tables, and logging, it will just log the SQL queries it is running. That connection of everything is inside a URL, and then SSL. Okay, so this is pretty much with our database class, database module imports, module imports. Here we have a controllers. We don't have any controllers. We'll just keep this empty. And any providers, we can create any service if we have. And if you are exporting those services, like I'm going to create a database later. So this is pretty much our database module. This is the database module service. So what we need to do is, now in the main module we need to call the for root function to initialize the typeorm module. Okay, typeorm module.for root async, we are injecting config module, and then getting the typeorm connection objects from the config service and the db config. Okay, so now how to use this? We have a database module, we'll create a database service. So how to use all sort of things inside our main module? So we are going to create a domain module where we are going to import all our modules which we have created. So we are going to create a domain module here inside this. This is the domain module. So how do we use all the modules we have created? So inside imports, we will import a db module. Let's say db module, it provides method for root. Okay, for root, and what is the argument it takes? If you see, for root is taking the entities. So this is how I will add the database module to my main module, because in main module you will add the database module, config module, and all these options. Here I will add the config module. What happened with this? Why this autocomplete is not working? This is the import. Okay, here it will be config module will come here. So we have just only 2 modules, but there will be a logger module, config module, and then all the user module we are going to add. So controller, I think controller we already have. We will add the authentication routes here, and inside domain we will also have the user modules. So we can create that user module where we are going to write a user APIs. So let's see how it is working. Okay, we are getting this typeorm connection errors because what is happening in the database module, entities are empty. Let's see what is happening here. So this is our app module. Inside app module, we are passing domain module. Domain module has a database module and the config module. So this config module injecting the URL. Now we'll go inside a config service. Database URL. This is the environment variable it is looking for. Okay. So how we are passing database module, database URL? There is no way, right? Here it is looking for env.database URL, otherwise default config.url. That is also dependent on process.env.database URL. So what you can do, either you export all these values inside process.env or use .env module. So we can use .env .config inside our main.ts on the top. What it will do is, you have a .env, which I guess I have. It will put all these values inside the process.env so that our values gets populated. So here is a port is this. Now we will run this again. What will happen this time is, I just added this line .env config. It will populate the values and it will put all those things inside the process.env. Once process.env has the values, our database module will have will get the URL through the config service using process database URL, which is already there in the process.env, and we get the URL in our database module. This is our database module. You can also print the values you are getting here inside this. We will add the logger, but for now console.log db data, db config and db data are empty. The URL is Postgres API, Auth API. That's why our typeorm connection is successful. So we added a config module to populate things from the .env to process.env, database module to based on the database type. There may be another variable you can add inside env type, and then you can use this db module as a global module. And here you write a switch case. Okay, get the connection option of for Postgres, for MySQL, for MongoDB based on type, and return the same options, because typeorm options are similar. Like synchronization false, if you make it true, what will happen is it will start creating the tables. And let's add the entities. How we are passing the entities? Through the domain module, which is here. Let's say I'm creating one entity, and I can look for some example here of entity from this class. So inside app domain auth, so let's, because auth will not have an entity, user will have entity, so I'm going to create user dot, it's still not a user, but for now, just for a demo, I'm going to show you user entity, and I think there is a parameter name, or it will take the user as a name, but you can also define the name of your table. Okay, let's say this is the user, and I'm going to import this entity here, user. Okay, now what will happen is, now I'm passing the user entity, class user, and this, and we need to check our database, because here what I'm doing is synchronization true. That means if the entity is there and database table doesn't have it, then it will try to create that table in the database. So let's me populate my Postgres. So this is my connection URL, and I'm using one tool for that. Let me connect with that, and we will see if the table has been created or not. Postgres from URL. And this is my tool, and you can see the user table has been created. Similarly, you keep adding the different entities. User entity, I'm just showing for the demo for now. let's say profile.ts, profile.entity.ts. Oh, I need to rename it, otherwise there will be an error. So it's a new entity, right? Synchronization is true, so it should create now. There should be 2 tables. Let's refresh it. Did I change anything? I need to import it here also. I forgot that. And here is the magic will happen, and we'll have 2 tables. Okay, that's it. So rest, let's take a look in next video. What we have done till now is database module, config module, how to populate the environment in the process.env, how to write a database module, how to initialize the typeorm module to accept the connections, and these parameters like passing the entities to initialize, and what is the synchronization option with the typeorm.